Translated with deepl.com. Disclaimer. This is an unofficial translation. Source.
Figurenzeichen.
Number 123 on pages 1 to 11. Extract from the 715th contact of Tuesday the 23rd of February 2019.
I'm afraid that's the way it is. Then my next question. At the moment the Anti-Abuse Summit is taking place in the Vatican, which will probably end tomorrow. The aim of this conference is to create measures against sexual assaults on minors and religious women committed by male Catholic spiritualities. The whole of the London Anti-Abuse Summit is to be aligned to the basic order of the Church duty, whereby all participants are to learn fundamentally also certain lessons. In everything that I personally judge to be the greasy theater of Catholic spiritualities and dignitaries wearing ornates the whole clerical power, just the religious and thus the presidents of the bishops' conferences and the religious superiors etc., also female beings, like religious superiors, from all over the world should be involved. In my opinion, the conference and the Abuse Summit is nothing more than a farce, which should serve for the calming of those people who denounce all the sexual machinations and attacks of the many guilty Catholic spirituals, whereby they can also show videos for their denunciations and for the above further education program, as well as witnesses who want to testify as affected persons what was done to them. There should also be a witness who should testify how she was raped by a priest and then, when she became pregnant, was forced to have abortions several times by the priest. And if one considers that the hypocrite in the Vatican of Rome, Pope Francis, describes an abortion as order killing, then it would have to be understood that he employs an army of order killers, because the aforementioned rapist priest is only one among many others in the same framework. And in this regard I can sing a song about what has been lamented to me in many places in various countries by women who have been sexually abused and raped by so-called high spirituals, priests and preachers etc. of different denominations. This began with deputies of Christianity, about Islam, Judaism, Hinduism and Buddhism as well as various sects and their chiefs. One woman even complained to me that her 16-year-old daughter threw herself in front of a train and died, while a woman hanged herself after the rape, as her mother complained to me. An elderly woman complained to me in tears when I met her as a sales representative during her house visit that she wanted to become a nun at a young age when she was given the name Sarah, but then on the one hand she was wronged several times by her novice master and finally also impregnated by him, while on the other hand she was forced several times by two nuns into lesbian sexual acts. Her pregnancy was violently terminated in the monastery by an abortion, in which she suffered permanent damage to her health. She also said that she had been treated like a prisoner, but had sometimes had to work in a garden outside the monastery, where she had managed to escape because she could no longer bear anything. But because she was ashamed that she had been treated like a whore, and because she was afraid that her family would insult her as such, she remained silent towards her strictly religious parents and her two brothers, and furthermore the novice master had forbidden her any contact with them and outside the monastery at all. Since her parents and brothers did not want to understand that she had fled the monastery because they wanted her to become a nun, she broke off all contact with them and built up and led her own life far away from her parents' house. And she had been doing this for 42 years when I first met her. Now, however, dear friend, I would like to hear what you have to report and what you have found out from the diners in the Vatican at the Catholic Anti-Abuse Summit. You have also said that you want to strive to see how this summit of the Catholic spiritualities proceeds on the one hand, but that on the other hand you also want to determine to what extent all these Catholic clerical powers are honest about themselves, and would reveal themselves, should any of them have made themselves guilty, if they are dirty.
I can only say that I can agree with your words, smeary theatre of Catholic mind and ornate wearing devotees. because what we have elicited from the majority of devotees participating in the anti-abuse summit is extremely frightening. And what has emerged to this day in the theatre, as you call it, corresponds to hypocrisy, which has no serious background with regard to an interest and a will to change and remedy the sexual abuse of young people, those subject to religious protection, nuns and other Catholic-believing sisters by Catholic dignitaries and or nat swearers and simple Gist cliché, as you called them all. If everything is looked at carefully and investigated, then everything in the conference results in absolute ridicule and also fraud, because behind the whole presentation there is no seriousness whatsoever. Our woundedness with regard to the fact that for the first time in the history of Catholic religion a conference is being held with regard to an anti-abuse summit has prompted us to call every single dignitary person of this anti-abuse summit to account. Not only to look at it now, but to fathom each person's entire life back to their youth, which has led to an extremely costly undertaking that required more than 400 of our specialists, who will be employed from the first day of the conference until tomorrow's end. However, we also felt the need to clarify what corresponds to the effective reality and truth with regard to the whole issue of the sexual abuse of minors by spiritual, every devotee form, thus from the lowest to the highest Catholic official. We have found out that not only boys, but also girls, as well as women of the people who are addicted to the Catholic faith, nuns and other sisters of male clergy of all office levels were and are sexually abused. Also are available spiritual, homosexual actions among their peers as well as outside their direct sphere of influence would be as common as lesbian relationships of the, as you have already called them, Jesus brides among each other or otherwise. We also found out that nuns also acted in the same way with regard to sexual abuse of underage girls and boys, but also with regard to lesbian sexual acts among their peers or outside their sphere of influence. In this context I would also like to talk about what, according to you, we clarified years ago in the nunnery, but never spoke openly about it in our conversations. But now I want to do this, because in connection with the fraudulent and hypocritical anti-abuse summit I believe that the time is ripe to openly name some facts. So I want to address what we have researched according to your statements, that at a certain place at the several centuries-old nunnery, you observed through binoculars how something was buried, whereby you expressed the suspicion that it could have been a burying of a newborn. So we had followed your observation and explored the closer and further surroundings of the many 100-year-old nunnery and found 3 specific places which indicated that these excavations had taken place, which is why we carried out extensive investigations. What we found there confirmed your suspicion, because we found 182 small skeletons of newborns there, which had been buried over several centuries. Through research in the past we were then able to prove that over the centuries sisters of the monastery were again and again impregnated by spirituals, and their fruit was aborted. According to the 182 skeletons found by us, pregnancies were also carried out and the children were born, but according to our findings they were then killed and sometimes even buried alive. But as for our investigation efforts, which we have been carrying out since the beginning of the Anti-Abuse Summit to check the participants in the Anti-Abuse Summit, they have brought extremely regrettable and unpleasant findings. Specifically, we have individually reviewed and researched all those participating in this conference on celibacy and its observance and attitudes, as well as their actions, behavior, mentality and accountability. And this was only possible by the above-mentioned large-scale deployment of more than 400 specialists in order to thoroughly fathom the truth, which results effectively in the hidden and in hypocrisy of the Catholic clerical power with regard to sexual assaults and abuses, and also with disregard for celibacy. And with regard to celibacy, which you have often described as illogical nonsense, as you said to a man well in this way on your journey back to the past with asceticism, and told him how the fanatical Christian religion would develop from his work as Catholicism and from its celibacy, I also find the term nonsense just as correct. After a ascetic, who recorded your conversation with Emmanuel, He replied to you after you had explained celibacy to him that such a request was not only contrary to nature, absolutely nonsensical, despicable, but also such that sexual excesses and misdeeds would inevitably arise from it. In this regard, we have examined all the clerical persons of the conference, especially with regard to sexual assaults on young people, as well as other incidents, such as sexual assaults on nuns and religious subjects, etc., in the past up to the beginning of their novitiate or up to the beginning of their formation, but also after they have entered into a religious community and are still active in it today. The results of our research are, as I already mentioned, frightening, because our experts revealed some catastrophic events and came to the conclusion that 73% of all clerics participating in the conference from the beginning of their novitiate did not adhere to the rules and regulations of abstinence imposed on them. On the one hand, homosexual acts with sensually like-minded people were carried out by them early on, as was the case during the following decades. On the other hand, they also carried out pedophile or child-loving sexual abuse on adolescents of both sexes. But in the case of the 73% of misdemeaning clerics, the clarifications revealed that the majority of them were guilty not only during their novice and ascent time and further education into their higher offices, as well as afterwards of sexual rape of nuns or religious sisters, but also of sexual abuse of women from the circles of the faithful as well as pedophilia, and thus the desecration of children and adolescents.
Like I said, the whole of this anti-abuse summit is nothing more than a sloppy and slimy theater that serves only the purpose of hypocritically winding up and dangling the whole world with lies and deception on a fool's rope, whereby the Supreme Conference Chair, called Francis, leads the slime theater in a deliberate, deceitful manner and is concerned that no hair is bent on any guilty rapists of children, adolescents, nuns and women. And this, in my opinion, is such that the ornate flock can continue unscathed in the traditional profession, but in ignorance of all believers and with the hidden warning to the sexual transgressors. Don't get caught. And in this sense many low spirituals, even up to the high clergy, will continue to drive everything forward in the old framework, because the imposition of the Catholic acceptance is idiocy is something that is not feasible. This, because even with the fanatical or other godly or Nats Fritz in the ode and the trousers stings, as it attaches with the salvation-believing hood bearers and Jesus Broughton in the same area, which naturally in one way or another must be counteracted and helped, be it by pedophilia, sexual acts with eresglycan, copulation with the opposite sex, or by personal hand operation, that is onanism, masturbation and thus own handiwork, which is denounced by Catholicism as idiotic and idiotic self-abuse. For my part, one find the whole thing that these 73% are Nats Fritzen. These are common sexual abuse monsters that all stink freck and unscrupulous at this anti-abuse summit, and to be involved in a completely impudent and innocent manner, although they know exactly how much dirt they have on their sticks, and have thus also smeared their ornate sacks, is really much more than just a bottomless impertinence and conscience, but effectively an absolute depravity. What I also think about the whole of this papal comedy of smears is that the whole theater is on the one hand a bottomless impertinence towards the believers, because they are misled and should continue to deliver their might for these lying delusional lurkers, so that these sexual abuse Pharisees can continue to indulge their abstinence-free degenerated lusts. And the fact that they are not even brought into the worldly laws for their crimes in this regard, as any non-clerical person of the people, who makes himself liable to punishment for sexual abuse, has to put up with, is probably more than just the hammer of shameful injustice. But since time immemorial this has only been due to his hypocrisy, the Pope, with his sneakiness, who can prevent this with the secular rulers and rulers who have fallen into Catholic religion and God's delusion of faith, by slimming down their faith and deceivingly lying that the wrongdoers would be punished by the Church. This punishment, if there is one in the main, consists at most in a transfer to another place of work, just to another village, another city or another country, and that is the end of it. But if I now also generally lead the religions with regard to the faith of the believers, then I have gained the frightening realization that Islam is at the forefront with regard to the fanaticism of faith. And this results from it, because people are driven to delusion and seduced in the way they believe, by the fact that the believers are made aware of their personal religious sectarian delusions in a populist way by the hammering in of the fanatical spiritual, religious populist supreme religious leaders, as well as the equally fanatical religious teachers. And these then become themselves susceptible to religious fanaticism of faith, but also fanatical and unscrupulous with regard to hatred, revenge, retaliation and killing, torture, murder, rape, massacre, destruction and warfare, if they are driven and trimmed to do so by fanatical elements of religious fanaticism and populism. In principle, it is exactly the same as with regard to politics, in which the people are lampooned with populist phrases until they fall for all the nonsense of beguiling whispers, and believe all the nonsense, because they are not needful and incapable of their own thinking and their own formation of opinion and decision. Already from your father's faith I learned in the 1940s what populism is, whereby this term actually originated from opportunism, which in truth corresponds to a demagogic or popular incitement and propaganda, which is pursued with the aim of conveying a certain direction of thought based on lies and deception. The fact is that any opportunistic populism is absolute, inevitable, and in any case a bend in the arm, by an untruthful, lying, and deceptive dramatization of the populism goal, in order to win the favor of the people, or at least their great masses. And since the people usually consist of simple and not highly educated people and are therefore effectively naive, or have no experience with populist themes, do not see through certain contexts and are also naive, they fall into a pro and chair war with the opportunist populists. And this happens as a result of the only low bourgeois education of the people, who as a rule, without distinction of age, are still absolutely green behind the ears with regard to opportunism and populism, childish, naive, inexperienced, immature and innocent as well as simple, harmless, simple, uncomplicated and incomprehensible, and therefore are not in a position to form their own personal and logical opinion according to the factors that arise, which must well be said. Opportunism and the resulting populism are based solely on purely useful considerations, which are aimed at achieving a comprehensive willingness on the part of individuals and the people to believe in the lead and deceitful false correctness, as well as an agreement and an adaptation to the populism goal raised by lies and fraud. And the fundamental purpose of this is, on the one hand, to gain power over man and the people, whereby as a rule everything is aimed at bringing man and the people under the opportunist thumb with new laws, regulations, beliefs and decrees, etc. which are hostile to the people, freedom and peace. And in the second place everything is based on the fact that the elements coming to power can enrich themselves at the expense of the people through horrendous rewards or even illegally. Opportunism and populism are actually basically one and the same, but the whole thing has to be divided into four different forms, namely into 1. Policy. 2. Religion belief. 3. Literature. 4. Ideologies. Sfath has given me seven points, which especially characterize populism, whereby in the 1960s in Germany I once mentioned these points to a group of people in Gießen, when I was typing through Germany with a friend and was asked by journalists, politicians and psychologists, who had a meeting in Gießen, how I stand as a globetrotter to politics and religious belief, and how I would see and judge everything. So I told the people, there were almost 30 of them, what I just had to say according to the teaching of Sfath. But then no newspaper published anything about it, only a photo and a small text about my girlfriend and me. but the 7 points that Sfoth told me about populism were neatly written down by several people, and I thanked them especially for them when I told them that populism would become of tremendous importance all over the world in the coming times, which had actually arisen from a self-designation of a farmer movement in Texas in the USA. Unfortunately, I can't bring the whole thing together today, not even the 7 points.
I know them from my father's annals, so I can tell you. These, Edward, are the 7 points which my father told you and which you mentioned in Gießen at the beginning of the 1960s. Without you being told who the persons actually were and what positions they held, they were in fact considerable government officials, as we were able to explore in our earlier investigations. And as far as the farmer movement in the USA is concerned, it was the Farmers' Alliance of the 1870s in Texas.
1. We are the people. The populists present themselves as representatives of the people and conduct their rhetoric with lies, deceit and beguiling representative of the people manner. 2. The power of language. The populists use a popular, simple language, which gives the impression that they speak in the name of the people, which deceptively simulates a similar connection with the populists. 3. Play with fear. The populists stir up fear in the people among their listeners with all imaginable untruths and the evocation of threatening prospects for the future. 4. Attention at all costs. The populists use every opportunity to repeat their lies and deceptions in almost endless repetitions until they are so imprinted on the audience that they become pathologically compulsive and therefore require consent to the populist. 5. Truthful exaggerations. The populists name the facts, but they exaggerate them in an excessive way and from them create suggestive conspiracy theories, which are so convincing to the audience that everything is accepted and represented as effective truth. 6. False news. The populists invent false, lying and fraudulent news, on the one hand to effectively misrepresent existing facts, on the other hand to mislead non-existent by lies and deception as given existing facts. 7. Effective staging. The populists take everything and everything in relation to themes, things, happenings, things, plans and facts and adorn them in their favor with exaggerations in such a way that the audience is blinded and misled.
Thanks, so I can get on with what I was talking about. With regard to politics, opportunism and populism are specifically about political elections, but also about revolts, demonstrations, civil and state wars, etc. This means that out of purely useful considerations through opportunism and the populism resulting from it, the individual and at least the majority of the people effectively hires a comprehensive willingness and adaptation to the respective propagated populist goals. Sfoth has assigned several attributes to the term populism, from Latin populus volk, that is, characteristic features or traits that are supposed to testify to infallibility from a lying and fraudulent opportunistic populist point of view. Characteristic are the populist intentions based on lies and deception, which refer to politics, religious belief and literature, and which are directed both at the individual person and at the people. These intentions are oriented in terms of choice of topics and rhetoric towards combining the mood of the individual person and the mood of the people with the goal of populism, and in doing so to nip in the bud and absolutely prevent one's own personal thinking, every formation of opinion and personal decision in the bud. Populism is about creating certain moods and faith factors in the individual person and in the majority of the audience as well as in the people in order to achieve a religious delusion and dependence of political, religious or literary form. And that, of course, only so that the populist rhetoric artists can swear by all the populist lies and deceptions of their individual people, a group of listeners or the majority of the people who become in bondage to them. And through this populist belief of the one man and the people, the boundless exploitation and strengthening of existing positions can take place for the purposes propagated by populism. In this way, The populism manifests itself in various specific styles of politics, in religious belief in God, in ideologies and in literature, whereby the whole thing in every case and in every way is a strategy to acquire power, wealth, religion, the belief in God and ideology, as well as literary misinformation to individuals and to the whole or the majority of the people, serves as well considered, conscious, malicious deception and exploitation, or is declared megalomaniacally as truth as a result of academic unproven hypotheses. Sfoth described any writing product as populist literature, which is based on the one hand on intentional or unintentional falsehoods, misinformation and thus on lies and fraud. This includes information notes, books, radio news, TV programs, small letters, journals, periodicals and newspapers, and any other written works. All in all, everything corresponds to the term literature and must be described as such, which is recorded in writing and published. This applies to all published literature, regardless of whether it is printed, handwritten, painted, or otherwise, when it is published. So also published fake news or fake news belong to the literature, whereby these are manipulative and fake news and spreading light truths, which in today's digital age are spread predominantly on the internet, especially in social networks and other social media, the so-called social media or similar, and partly virally or like a virus. Politics, religious belief in God, literature, philosophies, worldviews and ideologies are all extremely opportunistic populistically shaped by their operators, whereby since time immemorial all religions, beliefs in God, the Son of God, gods as well as saints, etc., have been influenced by their operators, who are also completely all of a dictatorial nature, are the worst and worst opportunistic populist organizations stupefying humanity, causing hatred, racial and religious hatred, discord, wars, bondage, quarrels, injustice and injustice. Just as it is the case in politics, so it is also the case with the spirituals and all religious fritzes, who in all peoples instrumentalize the unstable and opinion and decision incapable people populist, make them believers and drive them into deep fanaticism and delusion. It is a fact that the religious sectarian belief in the delusion of God also serves as a political instrumentalization and in this respect serves as a malicious basic evil of all religions to dominate humanity and not to let its own free will arise in it. In this way, the entire masses of people who believe in religion become compliant tools whose stupidity can incite hatred against other classes of the population and peoples and seduce them into acts of war. And since the peoples of the religious delusionists are incapable of perceiving reality in its truth, let alone of understanding it, it also remains hidden to them that every single religion or sect of faith not only corresponds to a dictatorship, but is in direct connection with malicious terrorism. Basically, the most malicious actors of all evil, all uprisings and wars, all hatred and all misfortune on earth are to be sought among those peoples and in relation to the entire earthly humanity where spiritualities of all shades are engaged in their insidious, intriguing, wicked, perfidious, tricky populist and greasily hidden politicizing as well as greasily beguiling machinations. The religious faith instrumentalization thus corresponds to a sneaky, hidden and misleading political machination of the faithful, and this is, as already said, a basic evil phenomenon of all religions, which make their deceitful dictatorial terrorist populist politicization the means of their power, their successes, their immeasurable wealth and their interests. All clergymen and politicians, who refer to their religious faith in their offices, are nothing else than hypocrites and pious men, or unneeded faithful or misguided and faith-dependent people, who are incapable of their own healthy rational thinking and thus of their own opinions and decisions. It has been a fact since time immemorial that the religions and the believers of these religions have been populistically abused for delusional and political purposes, and this abuse belongs to the most cruel capitals of human history, because out of the whole of the religious delusion of faith, only brutal and terrible wars have ever been waged, massacres, bloodshed, hatred, strife, murder and death, betrayal, lies and deception, as well as such a horrendous overpopulation, that now the climate, nature and its fauna and flora have already fallen into an extremely precarious state of ongoing destruction and destruction. Not only the sectarian madness of jihad plays an important role here, but especially the manifold and tremendous hatred among the earthlings among each other, because as a result of their uncontrolled mass propagation they had to move ever closer together and live together, which led more and more to frictions, quarrels, acts of violence and wars, and also in this day and age brings all the known as well as mankind often unknown destructive effects. From time immemorial everything has led to discord among all peoples, from the degenerated human mass propagation which had arisen in a degenerate manner. This discord has spread completely over the entire human race on Earth, and has led to acts of revenge and retaliation, as well as to hatred against other peoples and religious believers, and thus to religious wars and massacres. In particular, the religious sectarian faith factors, the delusion of God of all main religions, small religions and all other sects of faith were and are so degenerated in every way that practically hops and malt are lost to be able to penetrate the religious and sect delusionists in understanding and reason, and to explain to them the effective reality and truth of the completely natural. The delusion of God's faith has so clouded and even destroyed all senses for understanding and reason in more than the majority of mankind on earth, in the case of countless delusions of faith even to the point of being lifeless, that they have become incapable of grasping even the tiniest fraction of a jota of effective reality and its truth. In this delusion of religion and godliness that dominates them, the great mass of earthlings have become unable to perceive the effective reality and truth, let alone to think about it and to comprehend it. As delusional believers, they have become irretrievably delusional slaves and absolutely incapable of ever freeing themselves from their slavery of faith, as a result of which they are no longer able to cultivate their own rational thought processes and form their own opinions. As a result, they become more and more addicted to the stupefying of reality, more and more humble and dependent and controllable towards all and every false apostle, through which they are exploited in every way and seduced into enmity, discord, hatred, murder and manslaughter, as well as war against those of other faiths, whereby the sectarian delusional leaders can become immensely zealous and live out their desire for power over their believers. The whole with regard to the religious sectarian faith and the deviation from the natural reality and its truth led the majority of mankind on earth into all imaginable evil and violent degenerations, to which no more limits could be set and to which even today no limits can be set. This also includes the tremendous and destructive machinations caused by overpopulation, which needs thousands of different needs and things to satisfy its abundant life. The fact that the planet itself, as well as nature, its fauna and flora and all fresh waters, streams, rivers, lakes and springs are poisoned and polluted by waste of all kinds, especially plastics, as well as the oceans, is only of concern to a few environmental enthusiasts. All reminders and warnings are of no use, because the enormous majority of the overpopulation does not care a bit about it but continues unabatedly, uninhibitedly and unanswerlessly with the whole destructiveness. If the destructive and criminal machinations caused by the needs of overpopulation on planet Earth itself are taken into consideration, as well as the manipulations and cross-floating of nature, its fauna and flora, and of the atmosphere of the Earth, then of course the criminally changed climate, which is now producing immense natural disasters, also belongs to this. The ozone layer and the CFC that destroys it must also be mentioned, and I have to explain a lot about that, because knowledge of it is very important, as Svath taught me. The ozone layer is to be understood as a part of the stratosphere, which is located above the troposphere, which surrounds the Earth at a height of about 10-12 kilometers. The stratosphere itself is located about 15 to 50 kilometers above the Earth and contains, to my knowledge, about 90% of the atmospheric ozone. The sun's high-energy ultraviolet radiation converts the oxygen, O2, up there, in the stratosphere, into ozone, O3, whereby this ozone layer shields part of the sun's UV radiation and prevents too much of the aggressive UV radiation from reaching the Earth. While the ozone layer protects all life on Earth from the harmful ultraviolet radiation of the sun, the ozone gas near the ground endangers human health and the entire environment, irritating the eyes and mucous membranes and causing the worst damage to the respiratory system. Fundamentally, the ozone layer blocks much of the aggressive solar radiation, preventing too much ultraviolet radiation from reaching the Earth and causing damage. However, this only happens if the stratospheric ozone layer is intact, because it acts as a huge protective shield against dangerous UV radiation. If the greenhouse gases are examined closely, they absorb the long-wave heat radiation and thus strongly change the energy balance as well as the mean temperature of the planetary atmosphere, with methane, nitrous oxide as well as water vapor, ozone and carbon dioxide being the most important natural greenhouse gases. With regard to ozone pollution on the ground, I have learned that it is actually only problematic in summer, and only if there is intensive solar radiation, which makes it possible to produce ozone from the so-called precursor substances, whereby these substances usually result from emissions caused by mankind. With regard to the destruction of the ozone layer, it must be said that it is caused by gases, first and foremost by chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which were previously used on a large scale primarily as refrigerants. CFCs consist of organic compounds in which hydrogen atoms are replaced by fluorine and chlorine atoms. I have learned that the main greenhouse gases are only a few, the most important being carbon dioxide, CO2, which corresponds to an odorless and colorless gas whose average life in the atmosphere is around 120 years. In addition, however, there is the thangas, which is mainly produced by kettle as odorless and colorless, but highly inflammable digestive exhaust gas, but which is also stored in frozen soil and now escapes from the soil and rock and enters the atmosphere due to climate change caused by the thawing of the permafrost. However, this methane gas can be destroyed by chemical reactions, in contrast to the CFCs as greenhouse gases, which, as I have recently reported, are inert or inactive, uninvolved and sluggish. As a result, they are regarded as substances which, as it is written, do not react or react only to a negligible degree under the respective conditions with potential reaction partners, such as air, water, adducts and products of a reaction. Finally, there is also nitrous oxide, which is best known as a colorless and sweet-smelling laughing gas. The many and varied atmospheric pollutants irresponsibly caused by mankind include, above all, toxic greenhouse gas emissions, above all CO2. However, CFCs and chlorofluorocarbons are also worth mentioning, because, contrary to all lying claims of a different nature, these are still to a considerable extent responsible for impairing the ozone layer in the stratosphere today, but no longer to the extent that was the case in the course of the 1970s and 1980s when the ozone hole was the cause for which the CFC was responsible, of which hardly anyone talks about today in 2019 or even knows anything at all. CFCs and chlorofluorocarbons correspond, as I recently read, to a chemical nomenclature according to IUPAC, whereby IUPAC nomenclature means that the purpose of this nomenclature is to unambiguously assign chemical compounds their structure by their name, which is also referred to as the nomenclature of organic chemistry. According to chemistry, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, or freons, are an extensive chemical group of low-molecular organic compounds that are known as propellants, but are also used as refrigerants or solvents. CFCs are or were, as I have informed myself, hydrocarbons in which hydrogen atoms are or have been replaced by the halogens chlorine and fluorine, whereby these correspond to a subgroup of halogenated hydrocarbons. CFCs, it is taught, contain only single bonds called saturated CFCs. However, if the compound no longer contains hydrogen, the whole is called chlorofluorocarbons. And as I said before, during the 1970s and 1980s, the release of CFCs into the atmosphere proved to be extremely damaging to the stratospheric ozone layer and to the ozone hole. As a result, the use of CFCs has been banned in many areas of application, but according to your Playark statements it is still secretly misused to some extent today and continues to penetrate the stratosphere, to some extent still impairs it and also helps with climate change. What is done with this further and more homegrown abuse of CFCs is effectively unforgivable, but this is never a matter of concern, as a result of which the Earth's atmosphere continues to be very harmfully damaged by CFC greenhouse gases, just as ozone depletion still continues, albeit to a much lesser degree than in the 1970s and 1980s. In Wikipedia I found the following about the CFC, which I want to add to my words.
From Wikipedia.
CFCs are partially halogenated chlorofluorocarbons. Their hydrogen atoms are only partially replaced by chlorine and fluorine atoms. They have a much lower ozone depletion potential than CFCs. Their global warming potential is also far below that of CFCs. In addition, the CFCs are already degraded in the troposphere and only partially reach the stratosphere.
Properties.
CFCs are very resistant, non-combustible, odorless, transparent, colorless, and are often non-toxic or have low toxicity. The CFCs of the methane and ethane series have a low boiling point and can be easily liquefied by compression. Since they can absorb large amounts of heat during evaporation, they are particularly important as refrigerants. CFCs have a long residence time in the atmosphere due to their inertness to reaction. They therefore ascend into the stratosphere and are decomposed by the UV rays. This releases chlorine and fluorine radicals, which react with the ozone of the ozone layer and damage it. In 1981, Veerabhadran Ramanathan described that the very strong greenhouse effect of chlorofluorocarbons alone would warm the Earth's atmosphere by a full degree by the year 2000 if emissions were not dramatically reduced.
The whole destructive disaster on Earth began very early, because the problems in this respect began already then, when, according to today's time calculation on the 31st of December 1700, the number of 529 million Earthlings was exceeded, which in principle would be naturally permissible for planet Earth. And already since then everything has been done to multiply mankind by religious influences on the one hand, but on the other hand also religious wars were waged, causing destruction, masses of human blood were shed, and nothing else was omitted that could cause harm to nature and its fauna and flora. Already at that time, plant and bird species, animals, creeps, chirps, lizards, amphibians and animals etc. were decimated and even completely exterminated, which has been preserved until today. So everything began early and continuously and has been preserved to this day, namely all the destruction of the planet, of nature and its fauna and flora, of the seas, fresh waters, of the atmosphere and of the climate, which in the end has caused enormous natural catastrophes, which will now become even worse in the future. But if we consider the responsible behavior of the Earthlings, then we can see that this is practically non-existent, because as ever there are only a few people who even think about the whole thing. Everything continues in the old style, because especially everything is done worldwide to destroy the Earth by overexploitation, but also by other criminal machinations. If the idiotic drivel of the scientists, politicians and other big talkers as well as the rulers with regard to climate and environmental destruction is taken under the magnifying glass, who take absolutely stupid decisions regarding climate protection, environmental protection and climate improvement and put them into the world, then the whole thing howls to heaven. The fact is that nothing other than idiotic speeches are made, and in addition even more idiotic, false solutions against the destruction of the environment, nature, fauna and flora, water, sea and climate are devised and decided upon, which are neither feasible nor beneficial, because the problems mentioned are already obsolete when they are discussed, and therefore it is not possible to implement them, because during the conferences mankind has already grown by tens of thousands of new earthlings. Thus the fundamental cause and the true evil of climate change and environmental destruction etc. is not brought up, namely the excessive overpopulation of the earthlings and their endless further increase, and no measures are taken against it, but only stupidly idiotic talk is made and completely senseless. Crazy concepts and procedures are devised and decided upon. Of course, all this nonsense also spreads to the population, which is snooping around within the same framework and is calling for and demonstrating nonsensically for a stop to climate destruction, but has no clue that only a massive worldwide and perennial birth stop, as well as an equally worldwide and permanent birth control, can tame the problem of climate destruction. But this climate change will take centuries, just as it has taken hundreds of years to develop. But this is not talked about by the alleged climate experts, who want to know everything better, but have no clue what the origin of the whole is. And what needs to be done effectively against this? A massive ban on births for many years and global birth control. The climate hero troops, male as well as female, are on the one hand too stupid and on the other hand absolutely incapable of even perceiving the facts of climate change and the destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, the seas and fresh waters as well as the extermination of many species of living creatures, as a result of which they cannot find their way to the origin of climate change. As a result of their self-glorification and self-adulation, because they sun themselves in their titles, such as doctor, expert, professor, etc., they are unable to make any logical judgment in their ignorance of existing facts either, as a result of which they are no longer and remain nothing but stupid snoozers who let all peoples gang up on the fool's rope. And that with their stupid chatter they are also misleading and throwing into the pan all those who snap up the whole thing about climate change and begin to protest against it without knowing the effective facts and their true origins, is the bottom of the barrel. And this fact particularly refers to the young people, who on the one hand are completely ignorant of the truth of the primordial cause of climate change and are also disinformed, but on the other hand are inciting each other in their unneeded existence to publicly demonstrate in the false belief that the coming climate catastrophe can be stopped if less people would pollute the world and its atmosphere with cheap airplanes etc., but that the true reason is the rampant overpopulation, that they do not recognize and do not know, and moreover they obviously do not want to know and do not understand that either, because they do not want to see themselves involved in not being able to produce offspring themselves. And that is exactly what the young people and young demonstrators do not want with their Stop Climate Change, because their personal egoism for the right of procreation is not to be impaired, but that no procreation into the world should be set only for others, but not for themselves. So when the speech comes up and the demand is brought to them, they pinch and even claim in their ignorance that overpopulation has nothing to do with climate change, because they can neither perceive nor realistically comprehend its destructive machinations. This is an effective fact, about which not only the majority of all youthful and also older Stop Climate Change demonstrators are neither able nor willing to think, but also the majority of the entire earthling humanity is not. And the reason for this is the same for everyone, because they think egoistically only for themselves, but not for the earth, the nature, its fauna and flora. So the fact is that practically all opponents of climate destruction are egoistically only concerned with themselves, because making children and having children is a pure matter of private, in which nobody has to interfere. Therefore it is already excluded from the outset that even a hint of a thought can arise to the effect that no or at least much less offspring should be conceived and brought into the world. And this is so because for all of them only the touch of such a suggestion with regard to being able to consider descendants for a longer period of time or not at all, is regarded as a malicious, privately intervening and unjustified imposition in the absolutely personal sphere. And this egoistic attitude goes beyond all well-being and existence of planet Earth, its climate, nature and its fauna and flora, because what difference does it make to climate protection if the necessary measures to be taken are intended to put personal interests and wishes in the background or even abandon them? Well, there's 16-year-old Swedish girl Greta Thunberg, who wants school every Friday and publicly demonstrates for climate protection. This, in turn, is a great food for all those scientists, politicians, religionists and rulers, as well as for large masses of young people, to make themselves important and big in public in connection with the introverted Greta Thunberg. So the girl is dragged to public events and doesn't know what is happening to her and that she is selfishly exploited by others who hope to gain publicity for themselves unscrupulously and carelessly and can thus place themselves in the limelight of the world. And this they do all those who gather around Greta Thunberg or otherwise use him unscrupulously as a figurehead, in order to be able to shine in public with the image and word of their own person as well as with stupid speeches of the expert on understanding. Greta Tintin Leonora Ernman Thunberg, born on the 3rd of January 2003, has already become world famous as a Swedish climate protection activist, and her activities are already being abused by many young people, environmental activists, and high-ranking politicians worldwide. The use of Greta, the child doesn't know how it's done, attracts international attention, but by and large this is only hypocritical in nature. It is a fact that the truth is basically that the whole of the hype is not suitable for or used for a consistent climate policy, but only for the fact that many young people, politicians, scientists, wannabe and ruling people as well as religionists and believers in God can rise in pure selfishness and self-portrayal in public as big and important and not foolish sayings. If the school strikes Greta triggers each Friday are considered in relation to the fact that this action is intended to contain and stop climate change, then realistically the whole thing is nothing more than a shot in the oven. Even if Fridays for Food Tour has formed a global movement that will probably only go out again as a flash in the pan. I do not believe that school strikes will achieve anything, but that, on the contrary, they will result in unpleasant things that can cause difficulties, even if Sweden complies with the Paris Convention, for which I have taken this from Wikipedia.
From Wikipedia. Politics. The Paris Agreement on Climate Protection.
The Paris Agreement was adopted at the last UN Climate Conference. Which goals are pursued with it, on how are these to be implemented? An editorial contribution by Kindersake, the 6th of September 2018. The UN Climate Change Conference is a meeting of politicians and climate experts from all over the world. The most recent was held between the 30th of November and the 12th of December 2015 in Le Bourget, a small town near Paris. The agreement reached is therefore referred to as the Paris Convention. It is the first climate protection agreement to commit almost every country in the world, because all 195 member states of the UN have agreed to the agreement. Officially, the Paris Agreement will come into force in 2020. In the following, you will find out which goals are being pursued and how the countries intend to implement them.
What are the objectives of the agreement?
Limiting the rise in temperature. Countries have set themselves the goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. It should even remain below 1.5 degrees if possible.
Fewer greenhouse gases.
The aim is to achieve a global balance between emissions and uptake of CO2 by the second half of this century. So we humans should not emit more greenhouse gases such as CO2 than forests can absorb at the same time.
Support for poorer countries.
The world's poorest countries will be supported by richer countries in climate change mitigation, adaptation and mitigation.
How should the objectives be achieved?
Mandatory reports. In order to monitor how much CO2 each country emits and what it is doing to achieve its common climate goals, all countries must submit regular reports.
Financial aid.
The industrialized countries have agreed to provide $100 billion a year to poorer countries between 2020 and 2025. The money will be used to help them repair the damage caused by climate change and use more climate-friendly technologies.
Higher climate targets.
Starting in 2020, each country is to present its climate protection plans every 5 years. The new goals must always be better than the previous ones. This means that the targets are tightened up every 5 years in order to jointly achieve the ambitious climate targets.
Criticism of the Paris Accord.
Of course, it is a success that the countries were able to agree on common goals. But environmentalists believe that such an agreement should have been concluded much earlier. They also criticize the fact that climate targets continue to be set by the individual countries themselves and that they do not face any penalties if they fail to comply with them. Incidentally, the climate protection plans submitted by the countries so far are not yet sufficient to achieve the jointly set targets. So there is still a lot to be improved.